hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on what time zone you're in. As Holly mentioned, I'm Beth Wagner. I am a Master Facilitator at Fierce, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with all of you today. Holly did a great job with my introduction. I don't know that I would add a lot aside from I have been in the HR field for over 17 years now. So this topic that we're discussing today, which is all about driving performance and performance management, has been a focal point in discussion and work for me and also for my clients for about as long as I have been in the HR field. This is an ongoing conversation, and we'll talk today about how there's a grow light on this topic as of late as well. But today I'm just excited to bring this discussion to a whole new level for all of us. And so I want to share with you what our journey looks like for the next hour. Obviously, we're talking about 5 fierce conversations to drive performance. And to get there, we are going to start with the business case. So there is a whole lot out there right now about what's going on with performance management, and I want to evaluate that a little bit. I've got some research and some data. We'll do some deducting and figure out what's going on with performance management, and then secondly, why Fierce? So I am here on behalf of Fierce Conversations and Fierce Inc. So the question becomes, what does Fierce have to do with all of this talk about performance management, and more importantly, what are those 5 fierce conversations that we are encouraging leaders to have in order to drive performance? And along with just sharing what those conversations are, I will be sharing some tips and strategies with all of you as leaders so you can actually go out from this webinar and start to practice some of those to have more effective conversations. And finally, I want to share at the end of our webinar a wonderful example of how an organization, a client organization of ours, is using and leveraging these conversations and fierce skills and the results that they're seeing. And hopefully we will have time for a couple of good juicy Q&A. You guys always bring great questions, and I hope to bring some really great answers throughout the webcast today. So that's where we're headed. Let's dive right in. And before I flip to the next slide, I just want to share a quote with you, which I think many of us are familiar with. But it's, if you always do what you have always done, you always get what you've always gotten. And that's, I think they don't know whether Henry Ford or Mark Twain said that. But the reality is, when it comes to traditional performance management, what we've always done, once or twice a year performance reviews, forced ratings, has not and is not getting us results. In fact, a whopping 71% of organizations report that their performance management approach is actually ineffective. This isn't new news. This isn't new to any of us. It's the storyline that's been evolving steadily over the last several years, and organizations are now beginning to acknowledge it in a big way. So according to a Deloitte survey, recent Deloitte survey, the redesign of performance management is picking up speed. In fact, 79% of executives rate it a high priority, with 38% calling the problem very important. So if you hop on Google, which I have done quite a bit in terms of this topic, but if you hop on Google and type in performance management, I guarantee you will see example after example of organizations who are basically ditching the old traditional approach to performance management and experimenting with new ways. And I use that word experimenting because I think we're in the middle of this change, sort of the pendulum swinging from the old way to the new way. We're in the process. And organizations worldwide have put a grow light on revamping performance management. They want to create a work environment, as do all of us, where people are enabled to perform at their best, and hopefully they do perform at their best. So large organizations like Accenture, GE, Netflix, all of them have scrapped their age-old annual performance processes in favor of more continuous, ongoing feedback systems. And throngs of other organizations are really starting to follow their lead. So while the future of performance management is still a bit unclear, we're still in that wonky middle. We're not quite sure where we're going with it, but we know that what we're doing is not effective. We also know that organizations are starting to wake up and realize that change is really needed. So here's my question to you, because according to all that research, great, we understand that change is necessary, but what I want to know is, to what extent is a large-scale change actually happening, not just at the big companies like GE and Accenture and Netflix, but anywhere across the business world in the US, in North America, or around the world. And I'm going to ask this group to help me with that. So here's our first poll. I'm going to ask you to answer this question: to what extent has your organization revamped or taken action to revamp its performance management approach. We have a few options. First, we're taking swift action. So your organization then is on the cutting edge. You're already taking action on this. The second choice is we're doing our best. So we know the old way isn't working, but we're really struggling to take action or make a change. And finally, we are going nowhere fast. So we like the traditional approach and we don't see any reason to change it. So I'm going to toss it to Holly, who's going to bring up our poll for us, and you'll have an opportunity to vote. Again, to what extent has your organization revamped its performance management approach? A, B, or C? And we've got a lot of responses coming in. It looks like B is out in the lead. So I'll just give it a minute while people continue to make their votes. All right. We're still seeing B is kind of out in front. We're slowing down, so I'm going to take this as an opportunity to just talk a little bit more about what I'm seeing with responses. And thank you for your responses, because most of us have found ourselves in the middle, and we have people that are on the outliers as well, A and C. So if you answered A, we're taking swift action, you're actually in good company, because in a recent Accenture survey, they found that 79% of respondents said their organizations have moderately or significantly changed performance management practices in the past few years, and 45% of those respondents even said that they'd shifted from annual feedback to ongoing feedback in the last 5 years. That's a big deal. That's a huge change. Those are big numbers. On the flip side, if you answered B or C, you aren't alone either. So while many leaders are talking about changing, according to a recent article from McKinsey & Company, 9 out of 10 companies around the world still generate performance scores for employees. So while they understand and they're talking about the fact that they need to change, they're struggling to completely let go of those traditional metrics that they've been used to. So I appreciate all of your respondents, your responses. Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and bounce back to our slide deck for a moment and continue, because given all this data and research, here's my question, right? We've clearly identified that the old way isn't working, and while some companies are jumping in with both feet, there's still resistance, clearly, from making the full-fledged leap away from that traditional approach. So the question becomes why? Why are we resisting the change? We're saying that we need to change, but we're resisting taking the action. Well, McKinsey's research actually went on to show that the problem that prevents us from making a change, even though we may have dissatisfaction with the process, is simple, and it's uncertainty, which isn't simple, but the answer is simple. There's confusion, right, over what the revamped performance approach should look like. And more importantly, without that century-old approach to lean on, and yes, our traditional performance management approach of force rankings, et cetera, is over 100 years old. It was conceived, quote unquote, over 100 years ago. It's hard to know when we don't have our traditional approach to lean on. Leaders want to know, what do I do now? What's my action? How do I make sure I drive performance? And that's why we're here today. So we're going to answer that question for us as leaders. What do I do now? In the midst of all this change and experimenting and uncertainty, whether or not your organization is on the cutting edge of this movement or you haven't reacted yet, how can you as a leader improve your employees' performance and build a culture of continuous people development? So we have an answer for that. And if you read the title of this webcast, you know what's coming next. Start having the conversations. We're going to talk a lot about the conversations as leaders that you can or should be having or continue to have, because I know many of you are already having these. So how do you make them more effective? Now, I don't know about you, but I've worked for a multitude of different managers in the past, and some of them I would walk to the ends of the earth for. I still stay in touch with them. They are people that have inspired me. And then there are some I simply wanted to push over the edge of the earth, quite literally. So here's the thing, though. What separated the really great leaders from the bad leaders for me wasn't their expertise, although that's really important. It wasn't their status in the organization. It wasn't how hard they pushed me or what projects they put me on. All of those were important, but the differentiating factor was the level of connection that I had with them. It was the quality of conversations that I was having with those leaders on a regular basis. And so don't just take my word for it. According to Gallup research, the best managers make a concerted effort to get to know their employees and to help them feel comfortable talking about any subject, whether it's performance related or not. And at Fierce, we've seen this time and time again with our clients. It's a productive workplace is one in which people feel safe to experiment, to challenge, to make mistakes, and to support one another. And good leaders know this. The best leaders know that what leads to better employee performance and a productive workplace is the quality of conversations that they are having every single day with their team. This is not just the one conversation they have during the annual performance review. This is the conversations they're having every single day. And so often I'll hear from leaders, but Beth, who could afford to make the time to have that level of frequent ongoing conversation? I mean, we're all so busy, or I have a remote team, so I don't get to see them face to face. Tell me how I'm supposed to fit this in. And my answer is usually a bit of an irritant. Maybe it's irritating as well, but I like to think of it as an irritant, so it gets people thinking. But my answer is, who can afford not to have these conversations? Obviously, the research points to the fact that they're important. Who can afford not to? And it doesn't have to be so complicated. Oftentimes when we think about this, we think, oh, I have to add more meetings to my already over meeting schedule. And I just don't know where that time's coming from, but it doesn't have to be complicated. I had a manager once who had a very simple practice. She would take a 3-minute, what she would call a check-in break, or what was really a brain break, right? And according to experts, we should all be taking those. But instead of sitting at her computer for those 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, mindlessly looking at CNN, the Weather Channel, grabbing that other cup of coffee, whatever, she decided to use that 3 minutes and plop herself in one of her team members' offices or call a remote employee on the phone. And she always made it clear when she did this, she wasn't fishing or prying or didn't have any expectations. In fact, she'd just simply start with the question, is this okay? Meaning, do you mind if I sit here and check in with you for a few minutes? And then she would ask, what are you working on? And more importantly, what do you need from me? How can I support you? And she made conversation with her team by doing this a daily practice, a norm. More important, it was a daily practice that focused on the well-being and performance of each team member, the well-being. So this was a simple exercise. It didn't need to be scheduled out days or weeks in advance. It didn't need to take a half an hour. Those 3 minutes, though, were incredibly powerful to each of us on our team. And she created an atmosphere where each individual felt valued. And as Gallup has said, which is key to productivity, felt supported and safe through that daily practice. So according to Deloitte, to add some more data to all of this, one sign of positive change in this whole performance management movement is a rise in employee-driven communication rather than just one-way feedback. In fact, Deloitte says leaders increasing the quantity and quality of conversations is becoming a key to both team and manager success. So it's not just having one really big conversation every year, or 2 or 3 or monthly conversations even. It's increasing the quantity and the quality. So a question I'm going to ask you to chew on as we continue this webcast, because I know you're all thinking about it, is where do I add the time? And my question to you is to think about, how will you carve out time to have more frequent conversations with your team? Because if I go back, here's the research, right? That a key to team and manager success has clearly become leaders increasing those conversations, the quantity and the quality. We're going to talk about the quality in just a few minutes through the 5 conversations, but I did want to highlight that the quantity is also just as important. And like I said, even the brief ones count. So how does Fierce fit into all of this, right? At Fierce, we know that conversations are not a soft skill. In fact, and I know most of you have this experience, conversations are some of the most difficult and critical aspects of our role as leaders. This has, from a Fierce perspective, this has been our sweet spot for 16 years, working with organizations to really identify the conversations that are most important to success, and then providing the skill to have those conversations most effectively. It's one thing to identify, yes, that's a conversation I need to have. It's another thing entirely to say, I have the tools necessary to have this conversation well, right? So when we as leaders are adept at conversations with that skill, we do much more than communicate. This is not just sending the message. We build stronger teams and we drive our business results. And there is a distinction between having real conversations and talking at someone. So I want to pause on that for a minute. There's a big difference. At Fierce, we believe it's important to define what we mean by the word conversation. It's such a simple word, and yet it's so critical to what we do, because quite frankly, what many people consider conversation in today's world is far from it. The word conversation begins with three little letters, C-O-N. So for those of you in the English language, doesn't have a lot of meaning, but in Spanish, the three little letters C-O-N, con, mean with. And when we speak of conversations at Fierce, we're talking about being with someone in that dialogue. It's an exchange of ideas. It's not a one-way street. And yet, how many of you can think of leaders that you report to or did report to in the past who don't or didn't have real conversations? They left the with part out. It was a one-way street. In the traditional performance management approach, many times we're doing this. We're discussing ratings. We're talking at an employee about what they did right. So here you go, you got the raise, or what they did wrong. Nope, sorry, not this year. And the other 364 days of the year, we're filling them up with our own advice, directives via email. We're reactively managing their behavior. You know, we're saying things like, well, just don't do that again. And then we're waiting until the end of the year to really have the discussion. At Fierce, we don't call these exchanges conversations. We call these exchanges versations. There's no real sharing or two-way dialogue happening here, right? So consider this for yourself as a leader. What is the problem when we as leaders only ever have versations with our employees? The messages are being sent, the quote-unquote communication is happening, but we're not getting that follow-up, that feedback, that input, that other perspective from our team. So to truly drive value with performance management, leaders need to be having ongoing, high-quality, and supportive conversations between themselves and their teams. Not merely transactions, but conversations. And that's really what we're talking about today. When we say 5 conversations, we're not saying 5 messages or 5 email communications. We're saying 5 conversations back and forth. Now, just to put this in application, I conducted a recent client session with a team of directors, and there was an IT director in that group who was very courageous. And he was quick to point out that the reason he was taking this session was because of some feedback that he had been given by a pretty new employee of his. And the feedback was that he, the director, was too heads down and quite frankly out of touch with his team. And he abused email. I think that word was even used, abused email, because that's what he used to send out every piece of communication and messaging. So the employee shared with this director that it was really difficult for him to get clear on expectations or even gauge how he was doing. How was his performance? Because he wasn't having that conversation. He was just getting one end of the fire hose and the messaging. So even more, I think what that employee had shared with this director, which was wonderful, was that the rest of the team was struggling as well. And there was frustration because of duplication of efforts and confusion, and there were some real challenges. In fact, one of the employees had even shared that he was thinking he might just leave because there was so much frustration on how the team was being managed. So here's the thing, a belief that we hold strongly here at Fierce is this: our careers, our companies, our relationships, and our very lives succeed or fail gradually, then suddenly, one conversation at a time. So what does this mean? Well, the sad news is that most of us don't wake up until suddenly. In other words, the pain of the suddenly event is what motivates us. So we get a bad performance review, or we lose a key employee, right? And we think, how did that happen? Highly effective leaders know this. So what they do is they track their trends. They stay awake during the gradually piece of it. Every day, they know their results are either moving in the direction they want them to go, or they're not moving in that direction. And they notice that their team members are either productive, thriving, engaged, or they're recognizing that there's confusion. People are overwhelmed. They're dissatisfied. They're frustrated. Highly effective leaders know where their teams stand, and they use this information to course correct. So when something's off track, when the team isn't achieving results or an employee's performance isn't where it should be, they pause and they have the conversation. They don't write it down, put it in a file, and say, I'll get to this in January when our performance conversation is supposed to happen. They pause at that moment and they have the conversation. Now, the employee who gave feedback to his IT director is a good example of this. And the IT director was fortunate that this employee was actually tracking the trends for him and able to give him this feedback, because without that feedback, that IT director may have actually stumbled into a painful suddenly, right, and lost an employee, or maybe more. So as we all know, the world is constantly changing around us, and it is pivotal that we continue to check in with the people and the strategies that are in motion and that are important to us, and that includes our team. To set a team on autopilot never turns out the way we want it to. That's not a strategy. And the fierce approach is to explore more deeply what's actually going on. Because if you sense something isn't going as planned, or you're noticing there's something under the surface that doesn't seem right, you're probably right. And it's imperative to have the conversation and get curious. Otherwise, you're operating in a bit of a fantasy land, right? Just telling yourself what you want to hear, and that's not where real performance lies. So the important thing to remember here is to track the trends by having the conversations. And just to take this to an even broader level and share some interesting data, Tiny Pulse, which is an employee engagement survey organization, reports that 75% of millennials, so that's 3/4 of millennials in the workforce, and this is the largest generation in the workforce today, 75% of millennials would consider leaving their job if they felt there was little growth opportunity. Again, that's a big piece of information, and that's a really big chunk of that generation. And good leaders know this. They don't want to lose good people, so they're keeping an open dialogue, and they're tracking the trends to ensure they keep their talent intact, and that they're supporting professional development that's going to keep their high-quality performers. So here's a question for you to consider, and I'm curious as a leader. Here again, we don't track responses, so I don't know who's saying what, so just be authentic and we'll get an idea of how people feel. How would you rate yourself at tracking the trends on your team? So how are you doing? If you were to give yourself a grade, what would it be? A is, I give myself an A. I'm diligent about having the conversations, especially when I know things aren't going well or performance is suffering. I pause, I have the conversation. B, C, I acknowledge when conversations need to happen, but I don't always take the time to have them. And the final response is I'm failing. So I can't slow things down, or there's no need to slow things down with more conversation. Once a year is enough. So how would you rate yourself at tracking the trends on your team? We're going to toss it to the poll and get an idea of where people are at, and then we'll move on. So Holly will get to the poll. Great. Awesome. So we've got so far, we've got people that are voting. So go right ahead and rate yourself. Here again, I'm telling you, we don't keep track of who votes for what. So be honest with us and yourself. I think this is a good reflection for all of us as leaders to really take a second glance at how we're showing up, and then talk a little bit about what it means. How would you grade yourself? We had a whole bunch of people sitting right there in the B category. A couple of people have said A, I'm in it, I'm diligent, and then a few respondents saying, yeah, I'm failing. So I want to thank you. We're not going to move off of this quite yet. I'll respond to these as people are still voting. But I do want to say, regardless of how you rated yourself, the important step is to take time out to reflect on what's happening around you. It's important that you identify the conversations that you need to be having, and you can't do that if you don't stop and take a look at, how am I doing as a leader? I've oftentimes had leaders say, oh, Beth, reflection, stop, talk, pause, think, ask yourself questions. I'll use that term a lot, reflection. And I want to reiterate how important it is. In fact, there's been, and you know this if you've been in any of our recent webcasts with HCI, because I do talk about it a lot. There's a Harvard researcher by the name of Francesca Gino who has done a lot of research around the power of reflection. And she and her team came out with the results of their survey, or not their survey, but their research, that basically said Leaders who stop and pause and think about their behavior, and more importantly, their performance and what they need to do differently, those are the leaders that perform 20 to 25% better than their peers. 20 to 25% better than their peers. So these questions, how am I doing? Am I tracking the trends? How is that going? Those are important questions to be asking yourself, because what they do is they highlight the conversations you need to be having or the shifts you need to be making. So I appreciate all of your responses. Thank you so much. Here again, it looks like B was the biggest winner in the category. We acknowledge that when conversations need to happen, and we're human, and sometimes we don't slow down enough to have those conversations. So thank you for that. We're going to bounce back to our regularly scheduled program, our presentation. And so aside from reacting when things go off course, how do we as leaders take a more proactive approach to tracking those trends, and more importantly, improving that employee performance? Well, we have the conversation. That's why we're here to talk about this, right? And at Fierce, our expertise is in providing leaders with those actionable tips, strategies that they can use every day in their conversations to drive performance. And we're going to take a look at a few of these today, specifically 5 conversations that you should be having, and a few of those tips that you can leverage to make those conversations more successful. I'm not going to say that none of you are having successful conversations, because I imagine you are where you are today because you are having successful conversations. And how do you become even more effective? That's what we're looking at. So 5 conversations to start having. The first one, actually the first 2 are the usual suspects. They're the ones we think of quite often when we think about conversations we need to have. The first one is confronting behavior. Confronting behavior. So if you know Robert Redford, yes, I'm talking about the actor, director, business owner. He played a part in the movie The Horse Whisperer once. And if you ever saw that movie, he has a line in that movie where he says, knowing something is easy. Saying it out loud is the hard part. And confrontation conversations are just this, right? Thinking it to ourselves, getting frustrated by someone's performance or behavior or lack of is easy. Having the conversation is the hard part. In fact, these are often the very conversations that we put off. We make excuses for them, we avoid them, we tiptoe around them. We are that uncomfortable with confronting behavior. And there are legitimate reasons to be uncomfortable and scared about these conversations. I mean, let's be honest, some people don't react well when they're confronted, regardless of how eloquent and thoughtful we are and where our intentions lie. So we worry about damaging the relationship or someone walking away having misinterpreted what we said. That's reality. However, what is also reality is the cost of not having the conversation is much greater than the risk of it going badly. These needed conversations really do have a huge impact on performance. And as the saying goes, which I love, we get what we tolerate. So as leaders, when we don't confront behavior, we're making poor performance okay. And we're getting the results that match that. So our results continue to suffer. So if you feel as a leader that a conversation is needed, likely it is. And for those of you who are worried about that failed conversation or the what if, remember this, a careful conversation is a failed conversation because it just postpones the conversation that wants and needs to take place for real performance to be had. So what can you do to confront behavior with team members more effectively? Well, I have 2 fierce tips for you to help you with that a little bit. One is to deliver the message without laying blame. Just the word confrontation will evoke an adversarial reaction in people. I mean, most of us, because we're uncomfortable with confrontation, what we'll do is we'll arm and armor ourselves. Actually put on that battle gear before we go in to have these conversations. And when we go in that way, what does the other person tend to do? They arm and armor themselves too, right? And now we're fully ready for battle. And we even use language that provokes this. We say, I'm going to go head to head or toe to toe with this person. And this leads to nothing more than a battle, or even, if you want to say, a boxing match of sorts, where I lay the first punch with my message, and then I continue to pummel this person with my perspective until I emerge the winner, right? But do I ever really win that battle? I mean, do we really expect that when we enter a conversation this way that the other person's going to turn to us and say, wow, thank you so much. I'm going to go change that right now. No, they don't, right? They fight back until we're both bloodied and bruised. or completely frustrated and resentful. So if you are entering into this conversation trying to prove that you're right and they're wrong, you're doomed to fail before you even begin. No one wins that. No one. So instead, what can you do? How do you confront or call out someone's behavior without laying blame? Enter the conversation with less declarative statements and very simply ask more questions. This is going to help you shift your context of toe-to-toe, head-to-head, and it's going to allow you instead to confront the issue rather than the person. If you notice, the word confront has those three little letters, C-O-N, at the beginning of it, right? So if you think about confrontation, instead of thinking about confronting the person, think about being shoulder to shoulder with that person in front of the issue, searching for the truth. What's going on here? What's your perspective? Here's my perspective. How do we solve for this, right? Remember, this is a conversation, C-O-N. And your intent here is to help the other person to improve, to be in service of them, not to send them packing. If you're looking to send them packing, if you want to make them available to industry or kick them out the door, that's a different conversation. It's probably not even a conversation, it's just messaging and may require HR. This is about really, truly driving performance, and confronting behavior can be done in a way that's truly productive. The second tip, in addition to asking more questions and confronting the issue rather than the person, is to not put pillows around it. And this is the opposite of the toe-to-toe mentality. Those of us who don't want to hurt someone, and many of us fall into that category, we certainly are not ill-intended here. We tend to put a lot of pillows around difficult messages. So we say things like, well, I'm sure you didn't mean to do this. Or perhaps I wasn't clear with my expectations. And when we put a lot of pillows around a message, the real intent gets absolutely lost. I'm sure you have examples of that. The other person may not even hear what you really wanted to say, but they pick up on what they want to hear, right? How many of you like to be liked? Think about that. Do you want to be seen as a leader that people like? I think we all do, right? I want you to consider, if you want to be seen as a nice person with those that you work with, I want you to consider replacing the word nice with the word kind. Nice is saying what you think the person wants to hear. Kind is saying what you know they need to hear in order to improve and get better. So kind is being in service to our team members. And I don't know about you, but I certainly, those managers that I would walk to the ends of the earth for, there's something within each of us that responds to those people who level with us, who don't suggest our compromises. And those managers I want to walk to the ends of the earth for, it's not because they were overly nice and said everything I wanted to hear. They were usually the ones that didn't suggest my compromise or my compromises, that challenged me, but that also did so while enriching that relationship with the quality of the conversations they were having. So be that person for your team. Replace the word nice with the word kind. The second conversation, in addition to confront, is to coach. So as I mentioned earlier, many leader performance conversations are a one-way street. So our one-on-one conversations go something like this. Here's what you could improve. Here's how you can improve it. Let's follow up at your next one-on-one and see how things are going, right? There's no two-way dialogue happening with that. And at Fierce, with our years of working with leaders combined with our experience combined with a lot of brain science and behavioral science specifically, because we do lean into that. That's a very important part of our work. Both experience and science has told us that this approach to coaching, the here's what you're doing wrong, here's what you need to do differently, let's follow up in a few weeks, that is not effective. And instead, here's a few suggestions for how you can better coach your team members. The first one is to not give advice. So if you're sitting there thinking, but I love giving advice, and how can I be a leader and not give advice? It's not to say don't ever give advice. However, if you're looking to coach and create sustainable growth and development, advice does not help. Contrary to popular belief, it is not improving people's performance. Advice giving is one of the worst things we can do, because when we coach someone or someone comes to us with an issue and we go straight into advice giving, we're training people not to problem solve for themselves. Instead, just come to us because we have all the answers. That does not create real growth and development. In the article, it's called The Neuroscience of Leadership. So for those of you who haven't heard of it before, it's by David Rock and Jeffrey Schwartz. Their findings suggest that for insights to be useful, they need to be generated from within. They can't be given to people as conclusions. David Rock, for those of you who don't know, is he founded the Neuro Leadership Institute. He's a leadership expert. He's written a lot of books. And Jeffrey Schwartz is a neuroscientist. So the Neuro Leadership Institute brings leadership experts and neuroscientists together to talk about human behavior, and specifically around leadership. How can we become better leaders? What's our brain doing, and how do we shift behavior to become more effective? So their research said for insights to be useful, they need to come from within. They can't be given to people. In other words, when you give advice, it lands on a dormant brain. And when people are challenged to think through their problem for themselves and give their own advice to themselves, they create that insight that's self-generated and is more likely to allow them to implement change and take action. So, all right, don't give advice. But how do you do this? How do you encourage other people to solve their own problems, improve their performance, and not give advice? The simple and complicated of it. Get curious and really listen. So in our Fierce coaching model, the goal is to simply ask questions to help an individual work through an idea or issue. And when I say simply ask questions, it's also the thing that we find with our clients and with ourselves that is one of the hardest things to do, because in a way we're wired to give advice. That's how we think we're being in service, and it's a very tough behavior to break. So at Fierce, we start all of our one-on-one conversations with the same question. Given everything that's on your plate, what's the most important thing you and I should be talking about today? And then we allow the space for the other person to reflect and respond. As we say, we let silence do the heavy lifting. We don't answer the question for the other person if they're not quick to respond. We allow them to think about it. And as Henry David Thoreau once said, just to support this a little bit with a fun quote, the greatest compliment that was ever paid me was when one asked me what I thought and then attended to my answer. Right? Actually paid attention. So remember back to that Gallup research that we pointed to earlier, productivity happens when employees feel safe and supported. And in your one-on-one conversations, you can accomplish this by asking questions and then slowing down and really listening to the responses. Healthy leader-employee relationships require that you do this frequently and that you have the time and space for conversations to really take place, right? For you to listen, for the other person to have the opportunity to speak, you must go beyond that day-to-day transactional interaction and actually have the real conversation. So my challenge to you is to look at your calendar for this week. First of all, where do you have one-on-one conversations with team members already, and how do you shift your mentality going in? Instead of declarative statements, I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to get curious. I'm going to listen. And when you ask a question, don't sit there waiting for your turn to tell them what's really happening. Truly be present and allow them to do the heavy lifting, right? So that's conversation number 2. Conversation number 3 is really the most often misused and underutilized. It's to delegate. And delegation often gets a bad rap in our business world today. Many of our clients call it dumping. It's when we say, let me take all these tasks that waste my time and throw them on your desk, then I'll run away as fast as I can and make sure not to make eye contact. It's a drive-by dumping, really, and it's misused. At Fierce, we actually see delegation as one of the most powerful approaches to development that a leader can leverage. So how do you have more effective delegation conversations? Well, here's one powerful tip for you. Ditch the all or nothing approach. I think all of us, if we have been in business long enough, have had this happen to us. If you've ever experienced the whiplash approach to delegation, one day you're given an incredibly exciting, big responsibility. Congrats, you're ready to take this on. Then you make a mistake or trip up, or maybe you're not making the progress that you should be, and the next day your boss yanks the whole thing away from you and says, well, perhaps we rushed things and you're not quite ready for this. Let me just take it off your plate. That might make it easier. And for those of us that are eager to get our hands on that juicy work, our response is what? Our response is, no, don't take that from me. I like that project. So we become frustrated and resentful, and we get disengaged. I mean, we're confused about where we stand from a performance perspective. Will I ever be ready to take this on? So as a leader, you can prevent this whiplash all or nothing approach by asking yourself and the other person a few questions before you delegate. first is to ask, how often do I need to check in with this person, realistically? What will that look like? And secondly, what do I need to see from this person to feel comfortable managing from a distance? When you give someone a responsibility, doesn't mean there aren't going to be checkpoints. But the opposite side of managing from a distance is micromanaging, and there's a happy medium in there. So what do you need to see from this person to feel comfortable managing from a distance? And then flip it and have the conversation with the other person. So ask the other person, how often do you need to check in with me? And more importantly, what do you need from me to feel comfortable taking on this responsibility? So don't just dump, have the conversation. And so often it's here you go. Come with me, come back to me with questions. Or you got this. Well, I'll check in with you in a little bit. We'll see how it's going. Have the conversation before you hand out the responsibility. So consider the team members that are on your team. Who do you need to focus more on developing? And more importantly, how can you leverage delegation conversation as a key to improved performance? Not just dumping, but engaging in that dialogue. So 3 is to delegate. Conversation number 4 is a conversation with yourself. So there's a connection. This is be accountable. There is a connection between integrity and performance. From an organizational standpoint, having a culture with high levels of integrity means that employees feel leadership is trustworthy and ethical, right? So there's the Trust Index Employee Survey, TIES, T-I-E-S for short, is conducted annually by the Great Place to Work Institute, for those of you who have heard of Great Place to Work. And this survey measures a company's level of integrity by asking questions of its employees about leadership and management. With this data, TIES has found simply that the higher measure of integrity on this survey for an organization, the better performance of the company. So when people say, yes, leadership has high levels of integrity in this company, they're outperforming companies whose employees say, no, there's not a lot of integrity. So what does this say? This means, leaders, that performance lies on your shoulders. This is big data. So do you feel your behaviors are in alignment with your personal values and your organization's values? I mean, I would say even if your overarching answer is yes, there are likely areas that we can all improve. And the recommendation from us here at Fierce is to self-assess. I said reflect, right? This is a big one. A recommendation is to go through a personal integrity scan a couple times a year. Check in with yourself and have a conversation with yourself, which, yes, we can do. We can talk with ourselves. We do it all the time. And answer the following questions. As I consider my behavior, how I show up with my team, with my peers, with my clients, as I consider my behavior, my own personal values, and the values of my organization, is there a gap? Is there a gap? And if so, what conversations are required to realign? Here again, it's that reflection so that you can identify the important conversations that are necessary. And then the other question I would ask is just by when will I have these conversations? Because it does you no good if you identify them and then never have them, right? So there is a researcher of engagement by the name of Dr. Brad Shuck, who shows that close to 75% of employees, in his research anyway, shows that close to 75% of employees who work for leaders that they consider compassionate, accountable, leading with integrity, they are unlikely to leave their current organization in the next 5 years. And I think that's huge. In this age of constant experience and job seeking, while it can be hard to find the time to self-assess, it's critical because it's going to keep our bench strong in our organizations. It's going to drive performance. So ask yourself, how's my integrity these days? And do that reflection. That's a critical aspect of it. Ask yourself those questions. And the 5th conversation, which I think is the not so obvious conversation, is give positive feedback. We oftentimes think of constructive feedback. I'm focusing on the positive. In fact, David Rock, who I mentioned before, says positive feedback is a signal to the brain to do more of something. So he continues by saying when we acknowledge other people, we highlight the behaviors we want to see more of, and at the same time, we build their confidence and certainty around what they are doing well. This is a key ingredient to high performance. So if your recognition of other people occurs about as frequently as your annual performance conversations, you're lacking a real powerful performance tool. Providing positive feedback has been scientifically proven to lead to success, and it should be given freely by everyone and to everyone in the organization. And having said that, obviously positive feedback from a leader carries a lot more weight, right? It has the ability to really leave a long-lasting positive impact on individuals. And there is a right way and a wrong way to give positive feedback to ensure that it has that lasting effect. Most of us, when we give acknowledgement, will say something like, hey, way to go, great job on that presentation, or really great job, hard work on that project. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those statements, but those statements beg the question, well, what did I do well? What went so well? And this is where the power lies, because when employees know the behaviors that led to their success, they can repeat them, which means they have a better chance of repeating success. And before you give positive feedback, make sure you can articulate clearly those specifics of the feedback. So when giving feedback, identify when these behaviors took place, what the behaviors were specifically, and why it's important. So what was the significance? That changes the great job on that presentation or great job on that project, which is a nice compliment but not entirely helpful in sort of reinforcing that behavior. Great job turns into, wow, I was really impressed with how prepared you were in today's presentation. Now, you came to the meeting with your agenda polished, you were ready to go. You also were prepared to answer a lot of questions that weren't on the agenda. And I especially appreciated how you handled Jane's pushback on the timeline. I think she felt that you were calm and genuinely seemed pleased that she asked the question. So your thoroughness, how you responded to everyone, it really reflected well on our department. I'm grateful to have you on the team. Well, that took about 30 seconds. It's not a great job. And I'd say it was time entirely well spent. So my question to you is, who deserves your recognition? And then carve out time to provide that feedback and see the impact that it can have on performance. Here again, scientifically linked to success is positive feedback. So my question to you, again, is who deserves your recognition? Think about that. Another reflection point as a leader is to consider those individuals and write down the conversations that you need to be having and with whom. 5 conversations is what we've discussed with a few tips for each of them. So I'm going to sum it up before I share a quick story, and then hopefully we'll have a few minutes left over for a question or two. The first is to confront behavior. We talked about not laying blame, right? Confront the issue, not the person. And don't put pillows around the conversation. So remember that there's a difference between being nice and being kind. Be kind and be in service. Number 2 is to coach to performance. So don't give advice, even though we all love it. And remember that for insights to be useful, they need to be generated from within. So ask questions, get curious, really listen. 3 is to delegate effectively. Resist the all or nothing approach and really have the conversation before and while you're delegating responsibilities. 4 is to be accountable. This is the conversation with yourself. How's your integrity? Because remember, the higher the integrity, the better the performance. So check in regularly on yours and do that important reflection. And finally, give positive feedback. So we know that science shows that positive feedback leads to better performance. So remember to acknowledge often and be specific. Those are our 5 conversations. And before I wrap up, here again, just a client story I really want to share with you. We've had the privilege of working with an organization called Christus Health over the last several years. They've given us permission to share their story with you, so I wanted to do that today. And Christus Health came to us several years ago with a real issue. First of all, they're an organization, just so you all know who they are. They're an international not-for-profit health system that employs over 45,000 people in the U.S. and Mexico. And their leaders came to the conclusion that the organization had fallen into a trap. So this is this whole idea of nice, right? They had a culture of nice. And associates were actually mistaking Christus's value of compassion with avoiding difficult conversation. So the managers avoided having conversations that involved constructive feedback and giving constructive feedback to their teams, which led to disengagement, disgruntlement, severe lack of creativity, all of those sorts of things. So determined to make a change, Christus decided to partner with us. They invested in all new managerial hires, and we helped them put together a training program to train associates to have more meaningful and direct conversations, to give them the skill, not just say you have to have these conversations, but provide the skill to do so. And this is what happened. First of all, they trained over 1,500 Christus associates, and this has been several years. So this was not just happened overnight. This was several years of work. But they noticed a 50% reduction in executive turnover because of this work. In addition, the number of leaders requesting direct reports be coached was reduced by 80% because guess what? Leaders had the skill now to coach their team, which created that more quality, quantity conversation that we were talking about and led to that engagement and that overall trust between employees and their managers. And then they also measured a 36% promotion rate and an 81% retention rate overall. And because of all of that, they were awarded the ICF PRISM Award. For those of you who don't know, that's the International Coach Federation Award. When they see that a company has demonstrated professional coaching used as leadership and the effects that it has on the organizational culture, they win this award. Previous winners have been IBM, Oracle, Deloitte. So the power of conversations is being awarded and recognized at a high level, and they actually did so much work within their organization, they were awarded that. So I think that that's what we're working to accomplish through Fierce. It's really improving the results of our clients, one conversation at a time, improving performance of our teams and our businesses through that power of conversation. And if you want to learn more about Christus, just send us an email, info@fierceinc.com. We'd love to send you a bonus ebook on performance. Two of our executives put this together, Fierce Performance Management Tips and Tools to Unlock Potential. Goes back into some of the things we talked about today and goes even deeper. So if you want to email us, we'd love to send you those things. And you can also always check us out at fierceinc.com. We love to hear from you in any way that you want to reach out and contact us. But with that, I just want to thank you all for listening today. And I think, Holly, we may have just a few minutes left over so I can answer a question or two if the group has some. So I'll toss it to you.
All right, Beth, thank you so much. We do appreciate your presentation today. We have had some questions come in. We do have about 3 or 4 minutes left in the hour, so we'll get to the first one, possibly a second. And guys, if you haven't yet submitted your questions, please go ahead and submit them. Even though we are getting close to the end of the hour, we'll make sure that Beth gets those from you. So we'll take a first question from Lolly, and she says, how ambitious can we be with delegation? Like if we want to challenge our employees with something bigger than they may be up for?
It's a wonderful question, right? Because I think there are a lot of people that think to themselves, I'm not prepared for that. And they just require the confidence and the encouragement and the support in order to take that on. To me, it's a wonderful question. It goes back to conversation. So I think when you talk about being ambitious, it's about engaging in that conversation. If an employee says, I'm not ready for that, how do you devise a plan to help them step into it, offer them that support? And that's what really, when we talk about fierce delegation, which I didn't share fierce delegation model with you, but that's really what we do. We have levels of delegation that help both the manager and the employee feel comfortable taking on a new role with different levels of managerial support. So oftentimes we go to that all or nothing approach because we don't know how to create a step approach to delegation. It's just, well, I can give it to them and either be with them the entire time, or I can let them run with it and hope they don't trip over themselves. And fierce delegation offers you that step approach. So you can be as ambitious as you and your employee would like to be and offer that plan for success. So that's a great question. And I actually encourage you, go ahead and if you want to learn a little bit more, you can fierceinc.com. Our delegation program is described in quite a bit of detail. So feel free to browse that a bit.
All right. Thank you, Beth. We'll take another question. This one comes from Jim. He says, can you share a little more about the results your clients have experienced?
Yeah, so I know we shared a little bit about Christus, right? So that was one case study, and you can find their case study on Fierce. There's also several other case studies because we've really tried to create those case studies because it's difficult to quantify behavior change. It's difficult in all of our organizations, and it doesn't happen overnight. So what we've seen when we've worked with our clients is overall improved accountability, overall transparency. We've seen higher levels of retention and increased employee engagement. And a healthier culture. And when I say that, you think about trust. That's the first word that usually comes up in any of the sessions that I do or the client sessions that I do is how do we increase trust? Because there's not a lot of trust between leadership and employees. And it all goes back to having those real, authentic, necessary conversations, right, to drive results. So I would encourage you, Jim, to here again seek out fierceinc.com and check out some of those case studies, because there's a lot of specifics about organizations we've worked with and the results that they were experiencing because of their Fierce Conversations work.
All right, awesome, Beth. Thank you. So we have arrived at the bottom of the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap up our discussion. And we'll close with one more big thank you to Beth and everyone at Fierce. And as always, we do appreciate our audience members who tuned in with us. So from all of us here at HCI, thank you for joining us and have a great day.